Building a better world. To what extent did World War II's survivors succeed in building a post-war international system that protected people from the scourge of war, curbed militant nationalism, promoted human rights, and international collaboration? One important pillar of the post-war international system was essentially the foundation for a more collaborative, more international global economy. So the foundation stone for this was really laid during the Bretton Woods Conference, which was held in July 1944, with the war not yet at an end, but Allied victory all but assured. And it had gathered many delegates, mostly from Western states. Ultimately, the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc would not participate in the system. As these economic figures gather, and there were some very big people involved, including famous British economist John Maynard Keynes that represented Britain, there was a general feeling that there was a fundamental connection between the Great Depression and World War II. In other words, the failure of the market economy during the 1930s had created the tensions that led to World War II, brought into being these fascist regimes that tried to overturn the larger Versailles order. So the idea was, if you can rehabilitate the world, you had to fundamentally transform the world economy so that the economy wouldn't collapse, and basically various states would pursue their own selfish policies to the detriment of all. So the Great Depression had essentially revealed certain weaknesses about the global capitalist system, its lack of reglementation, and this had contributed to World War II. And the goal of the Bretton Woods was to figure out among the economic policy crowd is, how can we put into being a coordinated policy? What institutions could we create to not only rebuild the economy after World War II, but also create a system of collaboration that would make war among states unnecessary. So in many ways, the Bretton Woods Conference is the most direct and enduring legacy of the Atlantic spirit, because the World Bank, the IMF are still in existence. The GATT, in a way, is in existence as well. It's been folded in the World Trade Organization. The international monetary system from which the IMF emerges was basically dealing with the issue of currency exchange. I'm going to spare you the technical details because this is an economics class. But if you're going to have international trade, you're going to need to have a way of converting currencies between these nation states. So the IMF was basically created in that mold. The IBRD, which we now call the World Bank, was largely focused on European recovery, but it would ultimately be more significant as a development bank to finance third world development. The General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs was basically dealing with lowering the barriers, the taxes between goods between states, so that they would be able to pursue, essentially comparative advantages and pay a lower cost for their goods. So the way that GATT worked was essentially negotiating bilateral treaties that would then be enforced among all the members of GATT. And if you look at GATT between 1948 to about 1973, it really succeeded in lowering the trade barriers between the Western industrial states that helped them to grow industrially. Now, fundamentally behind all these kind of liberal market measures was a deeper kind of Atlantic spirit, and that was the idea that states that trade together, economies that are integrated together, can't afford to create war on each other. So economic integration and creating a more integrated global economy was also seen as not only economically more efficient, but as very important in the process of political reconstruction to create a world that was more integrated so that these states wouldn't feel they're in competition with each other. They were partners in trade rather than competitors for resources. Another major outcome of this period is really the idea of international law, the idea of a kind of a universal justice, that there's certain moral principles, basic human rights that adhere to any human being, regardless of what state you are born to, regardless of your gender, regardless of your cultural values. So this was really kind of first articulated during the Nuremberg tribunals, where the Nazis were put on trial for essentially forcing the world into war. And one of the ideas that they would kind of put forward at Nuremberg was the idea of war crimes, that they had been guilty not just of launching a war that people didn't want to fight, but that they had committed essentially crimes against humanity, and that this violation made them liable and they could be prosecuted on it. Now, of course, what the Nazis all argued is that they were nicht schuldig, weren't guilty, because on a technical level, they were being tried on moral principles that were exploited on them ex post facto. They hadn't broken any specific treaty. They were being held guilty for moral violations, as beyond the pale of what civilized people would do. The Nazi argument was there's no legal grounds for it, and this was victor's justice, because the Allies were equally guilty of some of these crimes, particularly the Russians, who, for instance, in the Katyn Forest massacre, had just assassinated Polish leaders and intellectuals and military commanders in if it wasn't a genocide, at least an attempt to destroy Polish intellectuals and their culture. So there were other aspects of international law as well. It wasn't just the Nuremberg Tribunal and the Genocide Convention that basically created an obligation of the international community to step in and to prevent another genocide. There was also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this idea that all humans share these rights that can't be violated by a state or taken away. In all these ways, it was the beginning of the international age, and the idea of international law as this standard transcending all cultures that could be used in a way to prosecute war criminals in the future. The final institution I'm going to talk about is, of course, the United Nations, that all Canadians know very well, but you might not know some of the history that went into founding this organization. So the United Nations was in one way a reincarnation of the League of Nations that had done some things well, although it had, of course, failed miserably in terms of collective security and essentially deterring foreign aggression from the Axis powers. Had been guilty of appeasement during the Spanish Civil War, the Manchurian Crisis, the attack on Ethiopia, and all of that. But there was a sense that some of this liberal idea that states in a kind of international system could work out their differences in diplomacy rather than through the force of war was good. What needed to be fixed was the weakness of the League of Nations, and that is that it didn't have any teeth. The United Nations was the idea that this would be a body with military forces that could intervene when some future Hitler crossed the line, so that would protect people from the scourge of war. So this dream was really created by FDR in the four policemen concept. The idea that the great powers would be, essentially guardians of the world and would prevent any future from acting. And the four policemen, by the way, was Britain and the United States and Russia, and the fourth was going to be China. Ultimately, that would be, changed in the sense that China would fall victim to the communist revolution, and France would be rehabilitated and brought back into the Security Council. One of the things that kind of marred the United Nations from the get-go and made it not able to kind of secure its mission is that all the great powers, these five great powers in the Security Council, had a veto. So this meant that they could stop the United Nations from intervening against their great power interests. And on a certain level, this was a necessary compromise to get the Soviet Union to join the organization. The United States as well insisted actually on the veto condition. But the consequence of this was that the United Nations wasn't very effective, because FDR's idea was that the Grand Alliance would stay together after World War II. But in fact, what happened is that the United States and the Soviet Union became locked into a Cold War. And since they were global rivals, they would just veto each other, and this would prevent the United Nations from filling its collective security role. However, the United Nations did, in a way, rekindle the spirit of the Atlantic Charter. Certainly the language of the Atlantic Charter is visible in its preamble. And you can see this idea of the United Nations holding watch, protecting people from the scourge of war. Ultimately, the United Nations would frustrate many of the Atlantic architects just because it became often a forum for Cold War bickering between the two camps, the Third World being kind of shuttled between them. Also, the United Nations, as it was originally installed, was essentially the First World and the Second World. But it was dramatically transformed because with decolonization, the majority became post-colonial states. And they, in many ways, tried to challenge, particularly the Western states, to honor the ideas of racial equality and to push the Western states to make good for colonialism and slavery. So this also made it very fractious, and it led the United States and many Western states to instead look to narrower international organizations like the OECD to meet their interests. NATO as well became the security organization because the United Nations wasn't very effective because of the veto system. So if we look at the period from 1941 to 1949, 1941 being the Atlantic Charter, where essentially Churchill and FDR kind of articulate the principles of building a better world, and 1949 being the beginning of the Cold War, the end of the Berlin crisis. What we see in this period is that the Eastern-Western Alliance stays together for the most part. And in various ways, because they remain partners in 1945, despite a lot of difficulties, a lot of these Atlantic values become concretized in various reforms. So whether it's the United Nations, the Bretton Woods Institution, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these become essentially the foundational pillars of a new, more liberal, collaborative internationalist international structure. One that is supposed to increase collaboration and protect ordinary people from the scourge of war. With a full outbreak of the Cold War, that liberalism is only kind of half fulfilled, and many of these institutions are not able to function completely the way that they were intended to. So in concluding, I guess I would like you to reflect on this, Atlantic blueprint, the institutions that were created between 1945 to 1949, where Stalin and the West were at least formal partners. You already looked at the Atlantic Charter, this ambitious blueprint. Think about post-war history. To what extent did the Atlantic Order fall short in terms of protecting human rights, preventing genocide, preventing aggression? And, obviously it fell short in many ways in places like Rwanda, where there was a clear genocide going on, and the United Nations, for various reasons, didn't intervene. And during the Cold War, essentially the United States and Soviet Union just vetoed each other, so it wasn't able to fulfill its peacekeeping role the way it was intended to. On the other hand, we can't just look at the gap between the Atlantic goals versus reality. We also have to look at what would the world be like if this system hadn't been in place? Because the UN still did things, right? It still helped to resolve the Suez conflict. The United Nations helped. The World Bank was important in terms of promoting third world development. The Atlantic or the Bretton sisters provide the foundation for an increasingly more integrated global economy. So, how significant were these institutions in creating essentially an era of peace and collaboration? Certainly one that was a lot more peaceful and collaborative than the first half of the 20th century. So, how do you look at these institutions? How do you evaluate them relative to the history that some of these events after World War II? Do you think overall was the Atlantic institutions a better alternative to them not being in existence?